Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a true psychological case study by diving deep into Fyodor Dostoevsky's absolute masterpiece, Crime and Punishment. Now, we aren't going to treat this like some dry, dusty 19th century text. No way. We're going to treat this as what it truly is, a gripping, forensic dive straight into the center of a murderer's mind. The source material we're working with unpacks incredibly complex psychology, the really crushing historical realities of 1860s Russia, and those timeless moral dilemmas about guilt, isolation, and redemption. And honestly, it's what makes this story so intensely relevant even today. So get ready, because we are stepping directly into the fractured psyche of a killer.
To really understand this, we have to immediately plunge into the dark, claustrophobic mind of our protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov. And we have to ask the ultimate existential question. Can murder ever be justified for the greater good? Picture this. Raskolnikov is a 24-year-old law student who's dropped out. He's living in absolute crushing poverty in this suffocating, coffin-like room in St. Petersburg. I mean, the walls are literally closing in on him. And for 6 whole months, in this tiny, oppressive space, he isolates himself completely. He cuts off his friends, his family, all to obsess over this single, terrifying idea. If you kill an objectively terrible person to save good, innocent people, is it really a crime? It's exactly this rationalization that sets the stage for one of the greatest psychological thrillers ever written.
You see, Raskolnikov's dangerous intellectual arrogance is rooted in a theory he actually published in an academic article called On Crime, and it was heavily inspired by Napoleon III's writings on Julius Caesar. He basically divides all of humanity into 2 distinct camps. On one side, you have your ordinary people. According to him, these are the submissive masses. Their sole purpose is basically just to reproduce, they live in the coop, and they absolutely must obey the laws. But on the completely opposite side, you have the extraordinary people, the Napoleons of the world. Raskolnikov convinces himself that these extraordinary men have an innate, absolute right to transgress laws, to step over corpses, to shed blood if it ultimately benefits humanity. And the really terrifying part, isolated in that tiny room, he decides that he is one of these extraordinary men.
This extreme arrogance fuels a deeply conflicting set of motives for plotting the murder of Alyona Ivanovna. She's a wealthy, miserable, and abusive old pawnbroker whom he literally views as a louse. On the one hand, we see this purely selfish Napoleonic motive. It's this egotistical desire to prove he's a Superman who can just step over conventional moral boundaries without feeling a single shred of remorse. But directly contrasting with that is a totally selfless, utilitarian motive. He sees his devoted mother, his sister Dunya, and his brilliant friend Razumikhan all suffering in desperate poverty. So he calculates that if he kills this old woman who preys on human suffering, he can use her hoarded money to do thousands of good deeds. It is a deadly, intoxicating cocktail of extreme intellectual arrogance and twisted altruism.
But here's the thing. This agonizing clash between his ego and his altruism, it isn't an accident. It's actually baked right into his identity. The very name Raskolnikov comes from the Russian word raskol, which means a split, a schism, or a fracture. Dostoevsky is telling us right from the jump that Raskolnikov is a man torn in 2. There's this violent, constant clash happening between his cold, calculated intellectual logic and his innate, deeply human conscience. We actually see his natural empathy right before the crime in this vivid dream he has of a helpless horse being beaten to death. It's a dream that leaves him physically sickened. So he desperately wants to be this ruthless, unfeeling Superman, but he actually possesses a deeply empathetic soul. And this severe internal fracture is what ultimately drives the entire tragedy. Let's track how this internal fracture inevitably leads to his agonizing psychological descent. It all begins with the mere idea. This triggers intense anxiety and a really repulsive trial visit to the pawnbroker. Yet, even as his body violently rejects the idea, his intellect essentially forces him forward to the brutal act. He takes an axe to the old woman. But then, tragically, her innocent, meek sister Lizaveta walks in. In an absolute panic, he murders her too. Instantly, the illusion is shattered. Instead of feeling like a triumphant historical Napoleon, his grand theory just crumbles into dust. He plunges into delirium, terrifying fever dreams, paranoia, and this complete, profound alienation from humanity. I mean, he literally passes out at the police station. He starts dropping massive clues to strangers in taverns. His subconscious is desperately trying to get caught because, deep down, his moral sense utterly rejects the atrocity that his intellect tried to justify. We really can't look at the pawnbroker's apartment just as a physical room. It's a direct metaphor for the darkness and chaos of Raskolnikov's own psyche. The sources highlight how Dostoevsky uses the setting itself to reflect internal madness. Think about it. The blood-stained axe isn't just a physical weapon, it represents the sheer brutality and the blunt force of his flawed philosophy. When he steps into that stifling evil place to commit the murder, he is effectively locking himself inside the prison of his own fragmented, obsessive mind. The physical isolation of that horrible apartment perfectly mirrors the spiritual and psychological isolation he's going to endure for the rest of the story. But beyond his mind, we also have to examine the crushing external environment. The St. Petersburg of the 1860s isn't just a backdrop here, it is an active, deeply oppressive force. Dostoevsky constantly bathes the city in the color yellow. You've got yellow wallpaper, yellow tickets, yellow, sickly faces. It represents biliousness, disease, and absolute squalor. The poverty is heavy and suffocating. The air is just filled with the stench of taverns, desperation, and sickness, pushing the marginalized inhabitants of the city right to the very brink of insanity. And it's precisely in this toxic, hopeless environment that a young, starving student's mind can breed such deadly, desperate rationalizations. Amidst all this toxic squalor, we encounter a truly vital moral counterbalance to Raskolnikov. There's a drunken, destitute man named Marmeladov who poses this heartbreaking rhetorical question. Can an honorable girl earn much by honest labor? He's talking about his daughter, Sonia. And this forces us to confront the desperate reality of marginalized women in this society. Just contrast Raskolnikov, who intellectually justifies taking a life to elevate his own ego, with Sonia. When honest labor pays absolutely nothing, and your family is literally starving to death, Sonia is forced to sacrifice her own body, her dignity, and her entirely innocent self, just to keep her stepmother and siblings alive. To really understand Sonia's sacrifice, we have to grasp the brutal historical context she endured. In 19th century Russia, prostitution was strictly regulated by the state. Women like Sonia were forced to carry a yellow ticket. This stripped them of their normal passports and subjected them to the constant degrading scrutiny of the medical police. It was a life of endless public humiliation. And the sources point out a truly devastating statistic. An 1889 census estimated that 58% of registered prostitutes contracted a venereal disease in just their first year. Doctors hastily saw dozens of women an hour in filthy rooms. So Sonia's gaudy gutter fashion dress? That isn't a choice. It's a uniform of tragic, hopeless sacrifice dictated by a totally vicious societal system. Yet somehow, despite this horrific environment, she astonishingly maintains her soul and a deep, sustaining religious faith. Now, we can map out Raskolnikov's two possible paths after the murder by looking at the figures surrounding him. On one side, you have the wealthy, corrupt Svidrigailov. He represents pure, cynical nihilism. Svidrigailov absolutely refuses to accept the truth of human suffering and meaning. It's this dark, empty path that ultimately leads to deep depression and his eventual suicide. If Raskolnikov fully embraces his crime and rejects morality entirely, Svidrigailov's fate is exactly what awaits him. But on the completely opposite side stands Sonia. Despite her horrifying circumstances, she retains her virtue. She represents passive, redemptive faith. She actually becomes Raskolnikov's pole star, the only light guiding his trembling existence through his crushing, self-imposed alienation. As the story unfolds, it becomes incredibly clear that the formal justice of the courts, and honestly the intense psychological cat-and-mouse games played by the brilliant detective Porfiry Petrovich, pale in comparison to the mind's own retribution. Porfiry actually suspects Raskolnikov almost immediately, but he doesn't just arrest him, he plays with him. He uses Raskolnikov's own psychology against him, basically waiting for the young student's shattered conscience to do the police's work for them. Ultimately, Raskolnikov is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in a Siberian military fortress. That's his external punishment. But the real punishment? That started the second the blunt end of the axe fell. It was the internal torment, the fever dreams, the total isolation from humanity, the agonizing dilemma of a conscience that completely refused to align with his arrogant logic. The formal law gave him a sentence, for sure, but his own moral sense gave him a living nightmare. So we leave you with this final, profound thought. For an entire year in Siberia, Raskolnikov still doesn't believe he committed a crime. He just thinks he made a mathematical mistake. But finally, through the relentless, magical love and submissiveness of Sonia, who followed him literally to the ends of the earth, his intellectual walls finally collapse. He realizes that true salvation actually requires accepting guilt and completely surrendering the ego.
He realizes there is no such thing as a Superman who is above the fundamental laws of human empathy. It's a timeless, incredibly powerful reminder that conscience must always, eventually, triumph over dangerous intellect. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. In our modern world, a world absolutely obsessed with success, ruthless ambition, and individual exceptionalism, how often do we still try to rationalize the unjustifiable?